Welcome to the Hidden Library. Today we unseal another forgotten volume of mystery from the shelves of the Hidden Library. In the quiet Surrey village of Rook's Hollow, Miss Jane Marple arrives seeking peaceful rest, but finds instead a web of old grievances, hidden passages, and a death that defies explanation. What appears to be an impossible crime in a locked room becomes a puzzle of greed, betrayal, and carefully buried truths. Stay with me through every chapter, for in this tale, nothing is quite as it seems, and the most dangerous secrets hide in the most ordinary places. If you cherish mysteries in the tradition of Agatha Christie, subscribe now. Your support keeps these forgotten tales alive in the Hidden Library. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're listening from. Now, settle in by the fire, let the village fog roll in, and join Miss Marple as she unravels the case of the Crooked Chimney. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Visit. The invitation from Dorothy Caldwell had arrived at precisely the right moment, as such invitations often do when one has reached that stage in life where the familiar routines of St. Mary Mead, though deeply cherished, occasionally require the refreshment of new surroundings. Miss Jane Marple had known Dorothy since their school days together, a friendship that had weathered the storms of marriage, widowhood, and the peculiar adjustments that accompany advancing years. "You must come and see Rose Cottage," Dorothy had written in her careful script. "I find myself quite settled in Rook's Hollow, though I confess the village has its peculiarities. Your powers of observation would find much to interest them, I'm sure." Miss Marple had smiled at this gentle reference to what Dorothy diplomatically termed her powers of observation. It was remarkable how one's reputation for noticing the small details of human behavior could precede one, even to the quiet corners of Surrey. The journey from St. Mary Mead had been pleasant enough, though the countryside beyond Guildford took on a more austere character as the train wound its way through the Surrey hills. Rook's Hollow, when she finally glimpsed it from the carriage window, presented itself as a village of considerable age and modest prosperity, its cottages clustered around a Norman church, whose weathered stones spoke of centuries of quiet worship. Rose Cottage proved to be a charming establishment, with mullioned windows that caught the afternoon light and a garden that showed evidence of Dorothy's careful attention. Miss Marple's hostess greeted her with the warmth of old friendship, though there was something in her manner, a certain constraint, perhaps, that suggested all was not entirely as it should be in this picturesque corner of England. "You look well, Dorothy," Miss Marple observed as they settled in the sitting-room with their tea. "The country air agrees with you." "Oh, I am quite content," Dorothy replied, though her fingers worked nervously at the hem of her handkerchief. "The cottage suits me perfectly, and the villagers have been most welcoming. It's only—" She paused, glancing towards the window. "Well, there are certain aspects of village life here that are rather unsettling." Miss Marple followed her friend's gaze to where, beyond the neat garden borders, the roof line of the village presented its familiar pattern of chimneys and gables. Yet one structure commanded particular attention, a building whose chimney stack leaned at such a pronounced angle that it seemed to defy both gravity and good sense. "The Crooked Chimney," Dorothy said, noting the direction of her guest's interest. "The old inn, you know. It's been abandoned for years, but somehow that chimney continues to stand, though it looks as though the slightest breeze might topple it." "Most remarkable," Miss Marple murmured, studying the peculiar structure with the careful attention she brought to all unusual circumstances. "One would imagine that any responsible landlord would have seen to its repair long ago." "Ah, but that's rather the difficulty." Dorothy lowered her voice instinctively. "There's been considerable dispute about who actually owns the property. The Ashford family claims it by purchase, while the Vennings insist it belongs to them by ancient right. Neither party seems inclined to spend money on repairs while the matter remains unsettled. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She had encountered similar situations in St. Mary Mead, where ancient grievances could simmer for generations, affecting the most mundane aspects of daily life. And the current state of this dispute? Most acrimonious, I'm afraid. Eleanor Venning, she's the last of her line, you know, becomes quite passionate on the subject. She lives alone at Venning Hall, about a mile beyond the village, and rarely ventures into company except when the matter of the inn arises. Then she can be, well, rather forceful in her opinions. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door, followed by the entrance of a young man in the uniform of the local constabulary. He was tall and earnest, with the kind of fresh complexion that spoke of outdoor pursuits and honest living. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, removing his helmet with careful politeness. "Tom Fletcher, ma'am. I hope I'm not intruding, but Dr. Fleming asked me to inquire whether you might have seen any unusual activity around the old inn this past week." Dorothy introduced Miss Marple, and the young constable acknowledged her with the respectful attention due to a lady of her years and evident respectability. "Unusual activity?" Dorothy repeated with concern. "I can't say that I have, Constable Fletcher, though I must admit I rarely walk in that direction. The building has such a melancholy air about it." Tom Fletcher shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a gesture that suggested considerable internal debate about how much to reveal. "It's probably nothing, ma'am, but there have been reports of lights in the windows after dark. Just glimpses, you understand, but enough to make folks wonder." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the deliberate precision that often preceded her most penetrating observations. "How very interesting. Might one inquire whether these reports have increased in frequency recently?" The young man's expression suggested that Miss Marple had touched upon something significant. "Well, ma'am, since you ask directly, yes, they have. 3 times this past fortnight, according to Mrs. Tompkins at the post office. She has a clear view from her upstairs window and has been quite concerned about the implications." "And has anyone investigated these mysterious illuminations?" Tom Fletcher's complexion deepened slightly. "Dr. Fleming and I had a look round yesterday evening, ma'am, but we found nothing amiss. All the doors and windows were secured, just as they've always been. No signs of forcing, no footprints in the mud around the building that we could detect." Miss Marple's fingers found their way automatically to her knitting bag, a gesture that always accompanied her most thoughtful moments. "Most puzzling indeed. Tell me, Constable Fletcher, was the former landlord of the inn a local man?" "Harold Briggs? Yes, ma'am. Still lives in the village doing odd jobs and such. Lost the lease when the ownership question became complicated. He's been rather bitter about the whole affair, if I'm honest." After the constable departed, Dorothy and Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence for several moments. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the garden and lending an air of mystery to the village beyond. "You're thinking something, Jane," Dorothy said finally. "I can see it in your expression." Miss Marple smiled gently, her fingers beginning to work her needles in the familiar rhythm that often accompanied her deepest thoughts. "I was merely recalling a similar situation in St. Mary Mead some years ago. Old Mr. Petherick's cottage showed lights after his death, causing considerable speculation among the villagers. The explanation, when it finally emerged, proved to be quite mundane, though the human motivations behind it were rather complex." "And what was the explanation?" "Someone with knowledge of the property's hidden features was using them for purposes the deceased owner would not have approved." Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "Buildings of great age often contain surprises that only become apparent to those who take the trouble to investigate thoroughly." She paused in her knitting to gaze once more toward the crooked chimney, its distinctive silhouette now barely visible against the gathering dusk. "Tell me, Dorothy, what manner of man is this Harold Briggs? I find myself curious about someone who would have such intimate knowledge of an old building's characteristics." "A capable enough fellow, by all accounts," Dorothy replied, "though there are those who say he never quite accepted the loss of his livelihood. He's been seen about the inn grounds occasionally, claiming to keep an eye on the property for the sake of the village's safety." Miss Marple nodded, filing this information away with the methodical care of one who understood that the most insignificant details often proved crucial in understanding human behavior. Outside, the shadows continued to lengthen, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, the crooked chimney maintained its peculiar vigil over the village of Rook's Hollow, its ancient bricks keeping whatever secrets they had accumulated through the long years of their existence. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The morning brought with it the crisp clarity that only November could provide, and Miss Marple found herself drawn to explore the village of Rook's Hollow with the methodical thoroughness that had served her well in similar circumstances. Dorothy, claiming a slight headache from the previous evening's rich dinner, remained at Rose Cottage with her correspondence, leaving her guest free to pursue what she diplomatically termed a constitutional. The village proper consisted of a single main street that curved gently around the base of a small hill, upon which sat the Norman church with its square tower. The shops were few, but appeared prosperous, a baker's establishment that filled the morning air with the scent of fresh bread, a draper's shop whose window displayed bolts of serviceable woolens, and the post office which seemed to serve as an unofficial gathering place for those villagers whose curiosity exceeded their immediate postal needs. Miss Marple's first stop was the tea shop, a cosy establishment run by Mrs. Martha Ridley, a woman of middle years whose bright eyes suggested both warmth and an inclination toward conversation. The shop was nearly empty at this early hour, save for an elderly gentleman reading the Times in the corner and a woman of perhaps 60 who sat alone by the window, her attention fixed on something beyond the glass. "You'll be Mrs. Caldwell's friend from St. Mary Mead?" Mrs. Ridley observed as she served Miss Marple's tea and scones. "Welcome to Rook's Hollow, though I fear you've come at rather a troubled time." Miss Marple settled herself comfortably, noting that the woman by the window had turned slightly at this exchange. "Troubled?" I had rather formed the impression that this was a most peaceful village. "Oh, it has been, traditionally speaking," Mrs. Ridley replied, lowering her voice to that confidential tone that invariably preceded the most interesting intelligence. "But these past weeks have seen a change in the atmosphere, if you take my meaning. There's talk of changes coming, developments that some welcome and others—" She glanced meaningfully toward the window table. The woman there rose abruptly, leaving her tea half-finished, and made her way towards the door with a dignity that spoke of good breeding and considerable determination. As she passed Miss Marple's table, their eyes met briefly, and Miss Marple observed features that were aquiline and intelligent, though marked by what might have been years of disappointment or carefully nursed grievances. "Eleanor Venning," Mrs. Ridley murmured after the door had closed. "Poor soul has carried the weight of her family's grievances for more years than anyone should have to bear." "The dispute over the inn, you mean?" Mrs. Ridley nodded vigorously. "Much more than just the inn, though that's become the symbol of it all. The Vennings once owned half the county, you know. Great landowners. They were before the Civil War changed everything. Cromwell's men seized much of their holdings, sold it off to pay for the parliamentary cause. The Ashfords were among those who benefited, purchasing Venning lands at a fraction of their true worth." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And Miss Venning believes her family was wrongfully dispossessed?" "She has documents," Mrs. Ridley said, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. Ancient papers that she claims prove the seizures were illegal, that her family never truly lost title to certain properties. The land around the Crooked Chimney is one such piece, and with all this talk of railway development, it's become quite valuable indeed. The bell above the door chimed again, admitting a man whose clerical collar identified him as the local vicar. He was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps 45, with prematurely grey hair and the earnest expression of one who took his responsibilities seriously. "Reverend Mallory," Mrs. Ridley called out cheerfully. "Come and meet Mrs. Caldwell's friend from St. Mary Mead." The introduction was made with due ceremony, and Reverend Mallory joined them at Miss Marple's table, accepting Mrs. Ridley's offer of tea with the gratitude of a man who had already been making pastoral calls since dawn. "I hope you'll find our village to your liking," he said to Miss Marple, "though I confess we're not at our best just now. There are tensions that I wish could be resolved through Christian charity and good sense. Mrs. Ridley was just telling me something of the historical complexities." Miss Marple replied gently. "It must be difficult for you, having parishioners on different sides of such a long-standing dispute." Reverend Mallory's expression grew troubled. "Eleanor Venning is a woman of deep faith and genuine conviction, but she carries burdens that perhaps should be laid to rest. The past cannot be changed, whatever injustices it may have contained. Our church roof, however, requires very present repairs, and the railway company has expressed interest in purchasing land for their expansion. If such a sale could proceed, it might benefit the entire community." "The church needs the money, then?" Miss Marple asked with sympathetic interest. "Desperately. The medieval timbers are sound, but the lead needs complete replacement. Without it, we risk losing our beautiful interior to weather damage within a few years. I had hoped that all parties might see the wisdom of allowing development to proceed, with the community sharing in the benefits." After leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple continued her exploration, making her way along a narrow lane that led toward Venning Hall. The countryside here was more wild than cultivated, with ancient hedgerows that spoke of boundaries established centuries ago. The hall itself, when it came into view, was a substantial Jacobean manor house, its red brick mellowed by age, and its tall chimneys reaching toward a grey sky. In the distance, she could see a figure moving among what appeared to be an extensive herb garden. Even at this remove, the purposeful nature of the movement suggested the same woman she had seen in the tea shop. Miss Marple paused by a gap in the hedge, ostensibly to admire the view, but actually to observe Eleanor Venning's activities more closely. The woman was tending what appeared to be a collection of medicinal plants, many of which Miss Marple recognized from her own gardening experience. Foxgloves grew in abundance along the garden's borders, their tall spikes now showing the dried seed heads of autumn. Eleanor moved among them with the confidence of someone well versed in their properties and uses. The walk back to the village took Miss Marple past the Crooked Chimney itself, and she paused to study the building more closely in daylight. It was a structure of considerable age, probably Tudor in its origins, with the heavy timber framing that characterized the period. The famous chimney was indeed remarkably askew, yet it showed no signs of recent instability. What caught her attention, however, were the subtle signs that suggested the building was not quite as abandoned as it appeared to casual observers. The path leading to the main entrance, while overgrown, showed traces of recent passage. More significantly, one of the ground-floor windows bore what might have been finger marks on its dusty surface, as if someone had recently peered through or attempted to clean a small section for better visibility. As she stood contemplating these observations, a voice behind her made her start slightly. "Interesting old place, isn't it?" Miss Marple turned to find a stocky man of middle age regarding her with curious eyes. His clothes were those of a working man, though clean and carefully maintained, and his hands bore the calluses of manual labor. There was something in his manner, however, that suggested a deeper knowledge of the building than casual interest would account for. "Indeed it is," she replied pleasantly. "I was just admiring the architectural details. That chimney is quite remarkable." The man's expression seemed to tighten almost imperceptibly. "Harold Briggs," he said, touching his cap. "I used to run this place before all the legal troubles started. Shame to see it standing empty like this, especially with winter coming on. It must be painful to see your former establishment in such a state," Miss Marple observed with genuine sympathy. "Aye, well, that's the way of things sometimes," Briggs replied, though his eyes remained fixed on the building with an intensity that seemed to go beyond mere nostalgia. "Still, I keep an eye on the old place. Know every timber and stone of it, I do. Wouldn't want anything to happen to it while the lawyers sort everything out." Miss Marple noted the particular emphasis he placed on his intimate knowledge of the building's construction, filing this detail away for future consideration. "How long were you the landlord, if you don't mind my asking?" "Near 15 years, Briggs said with evident pride. "Learned every secret the old place had to offer. Buildings like this, they have ways about them that modern construction doesn't. Hidden spaces, old passages that were built for times when folks needed to move about without being seen." As Miss Marple walked back toward Rose Cottage, she reflected on the morning's conversations and observations. The village of Rook's Hollow was indeed more complex than its peaceful exterior suggested, and the crooked chimney seemed to stand at the center of currents that ran deep beneath the surface of daily life. Harold Briggs's final comment about hidden passages had been delivered with the casual air of someone sharing local folklore, but something in his manner suggested knowledge that went beyond general village history. Chapter 3. Whispers and Warnings. The news of Cecil Ashford's arrival spread through Rook's Hollow with the peculiar velocity that characterizes important intelligence in small communities. Miss Marple first learned of it from Sarah Fletcher, Tom's sister, who had come to Rose Cottage that afternoon to assist Dorothy with some household tasks that required younger hands than her own. Sarah was a neat, observant young woman of perhaps 25, whose position as daily help to several village households had provided her with an encyclopedic knowledge of local affairs. While helping Dorothy arrange flowers in the sitting room, she spoke with the careful discretion of one who understood the value of information. "He arrived on the afternoon train," she reported, snipping the stems of chrysanthemums with practiced efficiency. "Took rooms at the King's Head, though Mr. Thornley says he's particular about his requirements. Insisted on having the corner room with a view towards the old inn." Dorothy glanced meaningfully at Miss Marple, who was seated by the window with her knitting. "Did he indeed? That seems rather specific for a casual visitor." "Oh, he's not casual at all, ma'am," Sarah continued. "Young Tom saw him at the station with a leather case full of papers and maps. Dressed like London gentry, he was, with a gold watch chain and shoes that looked like they'd never touched country mud. Asked particular questions about the crooked chimney straight away." Miss Marple's needles maintained their steady rhythm, though her attention was entirely focused on this intelligence. "Has he made his purpose known to anyone in the village?" Sarah's expression grew more guarded. "He's been asking questions, miss. About property boundaries and railway development plans. Spent an hour with Mr. Thornley looking at old survey maps, and this morning he was seen examining the exterior of the inn most carefully with some sort of measuring device. The afternoon brought further developments, as Miss Marple discovered during a walk to the post office. Mrs. Tompkins, the postmistress, was fairly vibrating with excitement over the morning's events, which she recounted to Miss Marple with the enthusiasm of one who had witnessed drama firsthand. "Such a scene as I've never witnessed in 30 years behind this counter," she declared, her ample form quivering with indignation. Miss Venning came in for her usual stamps, calm as you please, when in walks this Mr. Ashford with his London ways and his presumptuous manner. Miss Marple arranged her features in an expression of sympathetic interest. There was some sort of confrontation. Confrontation? My dear lady, it was nothing short of a public declaration of war. He introduced himself, cool as cucumber, and had the temerity to suggest that Miss Venning might be willing to discuss certain property matters like reasonable people, as he put it. Said he understood she possessed documents that might be relevant to his railway company's expansion plans. And Miss Venning's response? Mrs. Tompkins leaned forward conspiratorially. She drew herself up to her full height, and she's a tall woman, as you've no doubt observed, and said in a voice that could have frozen July, "Mr. Ashford, your family has already taken quite enough from mine. If you imagine that I shall allow you to complete your ancestors' work of theft, you are much mistaken." "Goodness," Miss Marple murmured appropriately. But that wasn't the end of it. He had the audacity to smile, actually smile, and say something about legal documents and modern courts being more reliable than ancient grudges. That's when Miss Venning really let him have it. Mrs. Tompkins paused dramatically, ensuring she had her audience's complete attention. She pointed her finger right at him and declared, "Mark my words, Mr. Ashford, the Venninglands will never belong to your kind. Some wrongs can never be made right, but they can certainly be prevented from growing worse." The implications of this exchange were still occupying Miss Marple's thoughts when she encountered Dr. Fleming later that afternoon. He was emerging from the King's Head, his medical bag in hand and his expression thoughtful. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." He greeted her with the courtesy due to Dorothy's houseguest. "I trust you're finding our village interesting." "Most educational," she replied tactfully. "I understand we have a visitor from London." Dr. Fleming's expression grew more serious. "Indeed we do. I've just been consulting with him, actually. Mr. Ashford requested my professional attention for a minor complaint, but I formed the impression that his visit here may prove more stressful than he anticipated." "The dispute over the inn property, you mean?" "Among other things. He showed me an anonymous note that was slipped under his door this morning. Rather threatening in tone, I'm afraid. Young Tom Fletcher has been informed, but there's little the constabulary can do about anonymous warnings." Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. Might one inquire about the nature of these threats? Dr. Fleming hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. "Nothing specific, you understand, but the general message was clear enough. Mr. Ashford would be wise to conclude his business quickly and return to London, or face unspecified but unpleasant consequences." The handwriting was disguised, but the paper appeared to be ordinary village stock. "Most disturbing. Has Mr. Ashford indicated whether he intends to heed this warning?" "Quite the contrary. He seems more determined than ever to proceed with his business. Mentioned something about arranging a private meeting to discuss the matter away from public scrutiny. Said he had reason to believe not everyone in the village was opposed to reasonable negotiation. That evening brought an unexpected visitor to Rose Cottage. Harold Briggs appeared at the door just as dusk was settling over the village, his cap in his hands, and his manner suggesting urgent business. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Caldwell," he said when Dorothy answered his knock. "I was wondering if I might have a word about the gentleman staying at the King's Head." Dorothy invited him into the sitting room, where Miss Marple was working on her knitting by the fireside. Briggs acknowledged her presence with appropriate courtesy before addressing his concerns to Dorothy. "It's about Mr. Ashford, ma'am. He's been asking questions around the village, and I'm afraid some folks might get the wrong impression about his intentions." "What sort of questions?" Dorothy inquired. Briggs shifted uncomfortably. "About the old inn, mostly. Its history, its construction. Who might have knowledge of its particular features? I fear he may be planning something that could cause difficulties for everyone involved." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with polite interest. "You mentioned yesterday that the building had hidden passages. Surely such historical features would be of legitimate interest to someone studying the property." "Aye, ma'am, but it's the use he might make of such knowledge that concerns me. A man like that, with his money and his lawyers, might find ways to exploit information that was never meant for outsiders." After Briggs departed, Miss Marple and Dorothy sat in contemplative silence for several moments. The fire crackled peacefully in the grate, but the atmosphere in the room had been affected by their visitor's obvious anxiety. "He seemed genuinely worried," Dorothy observed, "though I'm not entirely certain whether his concern is for the village's welfare or for something more personal." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her attention drawn once again to the view from the window, where the crooked chimney's distinctive silhouette was barely visible against the darkening sky. "In my experience," she said gently, "when people begin to speak of protecting information from outsiders, it often means they have particular reasons for wanting that information to remain hidden." She paused in her knitting to study the old inn more carefully. Something about its profile seemed different tonight, though she could not immediately identify what had changed. The chimney maintained its precarious angle, the roofline remained intact, yet there was a subtle alteration in the building's appearance that suggested recent human activity. As the two ladies prepared for bed, the village settled into what appeared to be its customary evening quiet. However, Miss Marple found herself wondering whether this peace would prove genuine or merely superficial. The ancient inn stood sentinel in the darkness, its crooked chimney pointing toward stars that had witnessed centuries of human drama, while the currents of tension that flowed beneath Rook's Hollow's placid surface continued to gather strength. Chapter 4. Fire and Death. The harsh knocking at Rose Cottage's front door came at 7:30 in the morning, accompanied by Dorothy's voice calling urgently from the hallway. Miss Marple, who had always been an early riser, was already dressed and making her way downstairs when she heard the commotion. "Jane, you must come quickly," Dorothy called, her voice tight with excitement and alarm. "Mrs. Tompkins is here with the most extraordinary news." The postmistress stood in the doorway, still in her dressing gown beneath a hastily donned coat, her face flushed with the exertion of her rapid journey from the village centre. Her usual composure had entirely deserted her, replaced by an agitation that spoke of genuinely shocking developments. "Miss Marple," she gasped, "you must see this for yourself. The crooked chimney. There's smoke rising from it, thick and black as you please. For the first time in more years than anyone can remember, there's a fire burning in that old hearth." Miss Marple felt a peculiar chill that had nothing to do with the November morning air. "Smoke? Are you quite certain? As certain as I am of my own name." "I could see it clearly from my bedroom window when I rose to let out the cat. A great column of it, rising straight up in the still air. The whole village will have seen it by now." Dorothy reached for her coat with hands that trembled slightly. "But how is such a thing possible? The inn has been sealed for years, and no one has authority to enter it." "That's precisely what makes it so alarming," Mrs. Tompkins replied. "Young Tom Fletcher has been sent for, and Dr. Fleming too. Something is decidedly not right about this situation." The three women made their way through the village with the purposeful haste that emergency situations demand. Indeed, as Mrs. Tompkins had predicted, the unusual sight had drawn villagers from their morning routines. Small groups had gathered at various vantage points, all staring towards the crooked chimney with expressions ranging from curiosity to genuine alarm. The smoke was unmistakable, a steady plume rising from the ancient chimney stack, its dark colour suggesting a well-established fire burning within. Miss Marple studied the scene with the methodical attention she brought to all unusual circumstances, noting details that others might overlook in their excitement. "The smoke appears to be from a wood fire," she observed quietly to Dorothy. "Coal would produce a different color entirely, and there would be more of it." Tom Fletcher arrived at a run, his uniform hastily assembled, and his young face grave with responsibility. Behind him came Dr. Fleming, his medical bag clutched in one hand, and his expression showing the controlled concern of a man accustomed to dealing with crises. "Has anyone attempted to investigate the interior?" Dr. Fleming asked, addressing the small crowd that had gathered. "We thought it best to wait for proper authority," replied Mr. Thornley from the King's Head. "The building has been sealed, after all, and there's the matter of trespass to consider." Tom Fletcher approached the inn's front door with careful steps, his hand resting on the truncheon at his belt. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe his examination of the entrance, noting his methodical check of the door and surrounding windows. "All secure from this side," he called back to the waiting group. "Doors bolted fast, and the windows show no signs of forcing." Dr. Fleming joined the young constable at the building's perimeter, and together they made a circuit of the structure. Miss Marple watched their progress with growing interest, observing that whatever they discovered seemed to deepen rather than resolve the mystery. "Every entrance sealed tight as a drum," Dr. Fleming reported upon their return. "Yet there's unmistakably someone, or something, inside that's maintaining that fire." It was Tom Fletcher who first glimpsed the interior through a gap in one of the shuttered windows. His sharp intake of breath drew everyone's attention, and his subsequent behavior suggested that what he had seen was far more serious than an unexplained fire. "Dr. Fleming," he called, his voice carefully controlled. "You'd better come and look at this." The doctor approached the window with the measured pace of one preparing for unpleasant discoveries. His examination was brief but thorough, and when he turned back to the assembled villagers, his expression had assumed the gravity that accompanies the most serious news. "I'm afraid we must break in," he announced. "There appears to be someone inside, seated before the fire. Given the circumstances, immediate investigation is essential." The breaking of the heavy oak door required considerable effort, even with the assistance of several strong villagers. Miss Marple noted with interest that the bolts holding it secure were substantial and showed no signs of tampering. They had clearly been engaged from within. The interior of the crooked chimney revealed itself gradually as the group entered with appropriate caution. The main room retained the character of its former use, with low-beamed ceilings and a massive stone hearth that dominated one wall. Before this hearth, in an old wooden rocking chair, sat the motionless figure of a man. Cecil Ashford appeared almost peaceful in death, his hands folded in his lap and his head tilted back against the chair's high back. The fire burned brightly in the grate, its warmth having maintained a comfortable temperature in the sealed room. On the mantelpiece above, two objects immediately drew attention: a partially burned sheet of parchment, its edges blackened and curling, and an antique pocket watch whose hands had stopped at precisely 11 minutes before midnight. Dr. Fleming's preliminary examination was conducted with professional efficiency, though his findings only deepened the mystery surrounding the scene. "No obvious signs of violence," he reported quietly to Tom Fletcher. "He appears to have simply fallen asleep by the fire." Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near the doorway to avoid interfering with the official investigation, found her attention drawn to details that seemed incongruous with the apparent peaceful nature of Ashford's death. A teacup sat on a small table beside the chair, its contents nearly finished, but showing an unusual residue at the bottom. The partially burned document on the mantelpiece appeared to be parchment of considerable age, though the flames had consumed too much of it to determine its original contents. Most intriguing of all was the question of how Ashford had gained entry to the sealed building. Every door and window remained securely fastened from the inside, yet here he sat, apparently having spent his final hours in comfortable solitude before the warming fire. Harold Briggs appeared at the broken doorway with remarkable promptness, his face showing what might have been concern or curiosity. Miss Marple observed that his clothing bore traces of soot, particularly around the cuffs and collar of his jacket. "Terrible business," he said to no one in particular. "Poor gentleman must have found some way inside and been overcome by the smoke or the exertion." Eleanor Venning arrived shortly afterward, drawn by the commotion like the other villagers. Her reaction to the news of Ashford's death was notably composed, showing neither surprise nor particular distress. "The Ashfords always did overreach themselves," she observed quietly to Reverend Mallory, who had also appeared among the gathering crowd. The arrival of Inspector Craddock from the county police brought additional authority to the scene, though it was clear that the circumstances presented challenges beyond those of a typical sudden death. His initial examination of the room was thorough and professional, though Miss Marple observed that he shared her puzzlement over the seemingly impossible nature of the situation. The inspector's questioning of the assembled villagers revealed little that helped explain the mystery. No one had seen Ashford enter the building, no one had observed any activity around the inn the previous evening, and the building had been securely sealed when examined just days before. As the morning progressed and official procedures took their course, Miss Marple found herself studying the crooked chimney itself with renewed attention. The building that had seemed merely picturesque during her earlier visits now presented itself as the scene of a mystery that defied conventional explanation. The ancient timbers and stone walls appeared to harbor secrets that went far beyond the recent tragedy, while the famous crooked chimney maintained its precarious angle above them all, as if keeping watch over the unfolding drama below. Chapter 5. Questions and Contradictions. Inspector Craddock proved to be a methodical man of middle years whose approach to investigation combined thoroughness with a healthy skepticism regarding village gossip. He established his temporary headquarters at the King's Head, where Mr. Thornley provided him with a private sitting room and the services of his most discreet staff member for taking notes, Miss Marple, maintaining the peripheral position that had served her well in similar circumstances, found herself naturally included in the various discussions that arose as the investigation proceeded. Her status as Dorothy's houseguest, combined with her evident respectability and gentle manner, made her presence both acceptable and largely unremarked upon. The post-mortem examination, conducted by Dr. Fleming with the assistance of a colleague from Guildford, revealed findings that transformed what might have been treated as a natural death into something far more sinister. Miss Marple learned of these results through Dorothy, who had encountered Dr. Fleming at the chemist's shop where he was purchasing supplies. "Digitalis poisoning," Dorothy reported quietly as they sat in Rose Cottage's morning room. Dr. Fleming was quite explicit about the symptoms, though he took care to speak discreetly. Apparently the concentration in poor Mr. Ashford's system was far beyond any therapeutic dose. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "Digitalis, from the foxglove plant, if I remember correctly. A heart medication in small doses, but quite deadly when administered in larger quantities." "Exactly so." Dr. Fleming mentioned that someone with knowledge of medicinal plants would understand precisely how to extract and concentrate the active compounds. The preparation found in the teacup was remarkably sophisticated. This intelligence cast a new light on the previous day's events, and Miss Marple found herself recalling her conversation with Mrs. Ridley about Eleanor Venning's extensive herb gardens. The abundance of foxgloves at Venning Hall would certainly provide the raw materials for such a preparation. Inspector Craddock's interviews with the principal suspects began that afternoon, and while Miss Marple was not present for these formal proceedings, The inspector's methods and preliminary findings became topics of considerable discussion throughout the village. Sarah Fletcher, whose position in various households provided her with exceptional access to local intelligence, proved an invaluable source of information. "Miss Venning was first," she reported to Dorothy while arranging the daily flowers. "Arrived at the King's Head promptly at 2 o'clock, dressed in her best black dress as if she were attending a funeral rather than answering questions about one." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with polite interest. "Did she appear concerned about the nature of the inquiry?" "Quite the contrary, miss. According to young Tom Fletcher, who was present to take notes, she answered every question with perfect composure, admitted freely that she considered Mr. Ashford an enemy to her family's interests, but denied absolutely any involvement in his death." "And her whereabouts on the evening in question?" Sarah's expression grew more animated. "That's where things became interesting. She claimed to have spent the entire evening at home, reading by her fire. No servants to confirm this, of course, since she dismissed her last housekeeper months ago for reasons of economy. But she did mention something peculiar. Said she'd been burning old correspondence in her garden that afternoon, getting rid of papers that served no useful purpose anymore." This detail struck Miss Marple as potentially significant, though she kept her thoughts to herself for the moment. The timing of such domestic activities, particularly given the subsequent discovery of the partially burned parchment at the inn, seemed worthy of further consideration. Harold Briggs's interview, conducted later that afternoon, apparently provided a different set of complications. Mr. Thornley, who had observed the former landlord's arrival at the King's Head, noted that Briggs had appeared unusually agitated and had requested a substantial measure of whisky before presenting himself to Inspector Craddock. "Nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm," was Mrs. Tompkins's assessment when she encountered Miss Marple at the village shop. "And with good reason, I'd say." Young Tom mentioned that Briggs couldn't provide a satisfactory account of his movements after leaving the public house. Miss Marple selected her purchases with careful attention while absorbing this intelligence. "He was at the public house that evening, until 10:30, so he claims, but what he did afterward remains unclear. He lives alone in that cottage beyond the church, and no one can vouch for his presence there until morning. More significantly, he seemed to know rather more about Mr. Ashford's business in the village than one might expect from casual observation. Perhaps most tellingly," Mrs. Tompkins continued, "Harold Briggs had been observed with soot stains on his clothing when he appeared at the Crooked Chimney following the discovery of the body. His explanation, that he had been cleaning his own chimney the previous day, was met with some skepticism, particularly given that his cottage chimney showed no evidence of recent attention. Reverend Mallory's interview, conducted that evening, seemed to provide the most straightforward account. The vicar had spent the early evening conducting a prayer meeting in the church vestry, attended by several parishioners who could confirm his presence. However, there remained a gap in his timeline between the conclusion of the meeting at 9:30 and his arrival home at 11 o'clock, during which he claimed to have walked through the village, making informal pastoral calls. Miss Marple's own investigation, conducted through the socially acceptable channels of afternoon calls and garden conversations, began to reveal additional layers of complexity. A visit to Mrs. Ridley's tea shop provided an opportunity to examine the fragments of the burned parchment, which Inspector Craddock had temporarily entrusted to Dr. Fleming for safekeeping. The remaining portions of the document appeared to be written in the formal legal language of centuries past, with references to rightful ownership and hereditary claims, clearly visible despite the fire damage. Most intriguingly, the Venning family name appeared in several places, though the context remained unclear due to the extensive burning. Quite ancient, by the look of it, Dr. Fleming observed as he carefully handled the fragile remains. The parchment itself appears genuine, though determining its legal significance would require expert examination by someone familiar with medieval property law. Miss Marple studied the fragments with the careful attention she brought to all potentially significant evidence. Would such a document, if authentic, have any bearing on the current dispute over the inn property? Dr. Fleming's expression grew thoughtful. That would depend entirely on its contents and the legal precedents involved. Property law regarding medieval grants and subsequent seizures can be extraordinarily complex. However, with the railway development plans making the land increasingly valuable, even a questionable claim might have considerable commercial significance. The question of how Cecil Ashford had gained entry to the sealed inn continued to perplex the official investigation. Inspector Craddock's examination of the building's exterior had revealed no signs of forced entry, while the interior bolts remained secure and showed no evidence of tampering. The windows, though old and somewhat warped, were firmly latched from within. Miss Marple found herself returning repeatedly to study the crooked chimney's exterior, paying particular attention to details that might have been overlooked in the initial excitement. Harold Briggs's mention of hidden passages during their earlier conversation had lodged itself in her memory, and she began to consider the possibility that the building's Tudor origins might indeed conceal architectural features unknown to casual observers. During one such examination, conducted while ostensibly admiring the village's architectural heritage, she noticed something that had previously escaped her attention. The ground around the chimney's base showed subtle signs of disturbance, not the obvious footprints that would immediately attract notice, but rather the kind of minor displacement that might result from someone moving carefully around the structure or disturbing the earth for some specific purpose. More significantly, the chimney itself appeared to have shifted slightly from its previously observed position. The change was minimal, perhaps no more than an inch or two, but Miss Marple's sharp eye for detail had noted the original angle during her first day in the village. Such movement in an ancient structure might be attributed to settling or weather effects, but the timing seemed remarkably coincidental with the recent tragic events. Chapter 6. Hidden Passages and Old Secrets. Miss Marple's growing conviction that the crooked chimney harboured architectural secrets beyond its famous leaning stack led her to seek expert confirmation of her observations. Her opportunity came during what appeared to be a chance encounter with Tom Fletcher outside the village church, where the young constable was examining the ancient stonework at Inspector Craddock's request. Such fascinating history these old buildings contain, Miss Marple remarked pleasantly, approaching with the gentle persistence that had served her well in countless similar situations. I've been admiring the craftsmanship of the inn's chimney work from my friend's cottage, though I could swear it appears to have shifted slightly since my arrival. Tom Fletcher looked up from his examination of the church's foundation stones, his expression showing the polite attention due to an elderly lady's observations. Shifted, ma'am? I'm not sure I follow your meaning. Miss Marple positioned herself where she had a clear view of the inn's distinctive silhouette. Perhaps it's merely the fancy of an old woman, but the angle of the lean seems subtly different from what I observed on my first morning here. Of course, such ancient structures are constantly settling, I suppose. The young constable followed her gaze with renewed interest. His generation had grown up with the crooked chimney as an unchanging landmark, making any alteration difficult to detect without the fresh perspective of a newcomer's eye. Now that you mention it, he said slowly, there does seem to be something different about the profile. Would you mind if I made note of your observation? Inspector Craddock has been most particular about recording any unusual details. This conversation led to a more systematic examination of the inn's exterior, conducted jointly by Tom Fletcher and Dr. Fleming the following morning. Miss Marple, maintaining her position as an interested observer, was gratified to see her suspicions confirmed through more scientific methods. "The chimney has definitely moved," Dr. Fleming announced after using a surveyor's level borrowed from the church architect. "Not dramatically, but measurably. The question is whether this represents natural settling or some other cause." Their investigation of the chimney's foundation revealed evidence that proved far more significant than simple structural movement. The massive stones that formed the base showed signs of recent disturbance, with fresh mortar chips scattered in the surrounding earth, and what appeared to be deliberate excavation around one particular section. "Someone has been digging here," Tom Fletcher observed, kneeling to examine the displaced soil. "And recently, judging by the condition of the earth." Miss Marple's suggestion that they examine the church's historical records proved remarkably fruitful. Reverend Mallory, despite his obvious preoccupation with the ongoing investigation, proved eager to assist in any scholarly research that might shed light on local history. "The Civil War period records are particularly detailed," he explained as he led them through the vestry's document collection. "The church served as a safe repository for many secular records during those troubled times. Among the carefully preserved papers, they discovered references to the crooked chimney's use during the Commonwealth period that cast the building in an entirely new light. The inn had apparently served purposes beyond simple hospitality, functioning as a way station for what the euphemistic language of the period termed travellers requiring discretion." "Smuggling," Dr. Fleming translated bluntly. The inn was clearly part of an organized network for moving contraband goods through the county. More significantly, the records included architectural notes describing concealed passages for the security of sensitive cargo and personnel. Among these documents, they found a crude but detailed sketch showing the inn's layout, including what appeared to be a tunnel system connecting the building to various points in the surrounding countryside. "A priest's hole," Reverend Mallory murmured, studying the faded diagrams. "Many houses of this period incorporated such features, either for religious purposes during the Reformation or political ones during the Civil War, but this appears to be something more extensive, a proper tunnel network." The discovery of the passage entrance required patience and methodical searching, but Miss Marple's conviction that such a feature must exist eventually proved correct. Following the architectural notes from the church records, they located the concealed door near the chimney's base, its outline so skillfully integrated with the surrounding stonework that it remained invisible until examined from precisely the correct angle indicated in the old drawings. Tom Fletcher's exploration of the passage, conducted with appropriate caution and proper lighting, revealed a narrow tunnel that extended for approximately 50 yards before emerging in a small clearing in the woods behind Venning Hall. The passage showed clear signs of recent use, with footprints in the accumulated dust, and what appeared to be fresh scraping along the walls where someone had passed through repeatedly. "This explains the impossible crime," Dr. Fleming declared with satisfaction. "Mr. Ashford's killer used this passage to enter the inn, committed the murder, then secured the doors from inside before escaping through the tunnel." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though certain aspects of this explanation continued to puzzle her. "It does resolve the question of access, certainly. Though one wonders how the murderer discovered this passage in the first place. The church records indicate it was a carefully guarded secret even in its original period of use. The examination of the passage yielded additional evidence that proved significant to Inspector Craddock's investigation. Caught on a rough projection of stone near the tunnel's midpoint, they discovered fragments of dark wool fabric that appeared to have been torn from someone's clothing during their passage. More intriguingly, a careful search of the tunnel's floor revealed traces of a white, crystalline substance that Dr. Fleming immediately recognized as digitalis in its purified form. The concentration and distribution of these traces suggested that the poison had been transported through the passage, possibly in liquid form that had subsequently dried and crystallized. Someone made several trips through this tunnel, Inspector Craddock observed when presented with these findings. The evidence suggests careful preparation rather than a crime of sudden passion. However, Miss Marple found herself troubled by an inconsistency that seemed to escape the official investigation. Harold Briggs had mentioned his knowledge of the inn's hidden features during their conversation, yet when questioned by Inspector Craddock, he had claimed complete ignorance of any secret passages. This contradiction suggested either deliberate deception or knowledge gained through means he preferred not to reveal. Her discreet inquiries among the villagers revealed that Briggs had indeed been seen near the woods behind Venning Hall on several occasions during the weeks preceding Ashford's arrival. His explanation, that he was gathering fallen timber for his fire, seemed plausible enough, but the timing and location of these activities now appeared in a different light. During a carefully casual conversation with Eleanor Venning herself, conducted under the pretext of admiring the herb garden at Venning Hall, Miss Marple learned information that complicated the emerging picture. Eleanor's knowledge of the secret passage, when delicately explored, proved to be far less complete than might have been expected. "I've heard family stories about hidden tunnels," Eleanor admitted, "but I always assumed they were merely legend. My great-uncle supposedly mentioned such things, but he was known for his romantic imagination. It wasn't until this recent investigation that I learned there might be truth to those old tales." Miss Marple's sharp eye noted that Eleanor's foxglove plants showed no signs of recent harvesting, despite the discovery of digitalis residue in the tunnel. The plants were mature and undisturbed, their seed heads intact, and their lower leaves showing the natural yellowing of the season, rather than the precise cutting that would accompany medicinal preparation. These observations, combined with her growing understanding of the personalities involved, began to suggest a different interpretation of events. The obvious solution, while mechanically sound, failed to account for certain crucial aspects of human nature that Miss Marple had learned to recognize through decades of observing village life. Chapter 7. The Truth Emerges. Miss Marple's gradual understanding of the true circumstances surrounding Cecil Ashford's death came not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small inconsistencies that, when viewed together, painted a picture quite different from the one that had initially emerged. Her methodology, refined through years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead, relied upon the principle that people's actions, however carefully planned, inevitably betrayed their true character and motivations. The first significant piece of the puzzle revealed itself during what appeared to be a chance encounter with Harold Briggs near the village baker's shop. Miss Marple, having learned from Sarah Fletcher that Briggs regularly purchased his daily bread at precisely 9 o'clock each morning, positioned herself to observe his routine behavior during this ordinary transaction. "Such unseasonably mild weather we've been having," she remarked pleasantly, as Briggs emerged from the shop with his customary loaf. Briggs paused politely, though his eyes held the wariness of a man under considerable strain. "Indeed, ma'am, though I fear we'll pay for it with a harsh winter to come." Miss Marple noted with interest that his jacket, while clean and carefully mended, showed evidence of recent repair work around the right shoulder and sleeve, precisely where fabric might be torn during passage through a narrow space. The mending was skillfully done, but the thread was of a slightly different shade than the original fabric. "I do hope the recent unpleasantness hasn't affected your employment prospects too severely," she continued with gentle sympathy. "Mrs. Caldwell mentioned that you've been doing some maintenance work around old buildings recently." Briggs's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I do what work I can find, ma'am. A man with practical skills can always make himself useful." "Oh, I'm sure that's true. Such knowledge of old construction methods must be valuable, particularly with buildings like the crooked chimney that have such complex histories. The effect of this casual observation was immediate and telling. Briggs's hands clenched involuntarily around his package, and a flush of colour rose in his cheeks before he regained his composure. "I wouldn't know anything special about the old inn, ma'am. Just what any former landlord might know about keeping the place in good repair." Miss Marple's gentle smile remained unchanged, though her eyes had grown sharp with interest. "Of course. Though I imagine 15 years of managing such a property would give one quite intimate knowledge of its particular features." This conversation, brief as it was, provided Miss Marple with confirmation of suspicions that had been growing since her discovery of the secret passage. Briggs's reaction to any mention of specialized knowledge about the inn, combined with the evidence of recent repairs to his clothing, suggested involvement far beyond what he had admitted to Inspector Craddock. Her next line of inquiry focused on the source and preparation of the digitalis poison. Through discreet conversations with Dr. Fleming, conducted under the guise of discussing medicinal herbs for her own minor ailments, she learned details about the poison's preparation that proved crucial to understanding the crime. The digitalis found in Mr. Ashford's system was remarkably pure, Dr. Fleming explained as they walked through his small surgery garden. Such a preparation would require not only botanical knowledge, but also access to proper extraction equipment. It's not something one could accomplish with simple household methods. Miss Marple paused to examine a plant whose leaves bore similarity to those she had observed in Eleanor Venning's garden. Would such equipment be commonly available in a village like this? Not commonly, no. However, someone with pharmaceutical training might have retained the necessary apparatus from their professional days. The village apothecary's shop, for instance, was quite well equipped before it closed some years ago. This intelligence led Miss Marple to reconsider Harold Briggs's background more carefully. Her subsequent inquiries, conducted through the socially acceptable channels of village gossip and historical interest, revealed that the former apothecary's shop had been sold to Briggs when the elderly pharmacist retired. While Briggs had not continued the pharmaceutical business, he had retained much of the equipment for what he claimed were personal interests in traditional remedies. The question of the burned parchment found on the inn's mantelpiece required more delicate investigation. Miss Marple's approach to Eleanor Venning, conducted through the medium of a shared interest in historical documents, gradually revealed the true significance of the mysterious deed. "My family's papers are quite extensive," Eleanor explained during one of their garden conversations. "Generations of legal documents, property deeds, correspondence with solicitors. The railway development has made some of these old papers suddenly relevant again." Miss Marple's gentle persistence in discussing these family records eventually led Eleanor to reveal the existence of an original deed, dating from the pre-Civil War period, that established the Venning family's ownership of several properties subsequently seized during the Commonwealth. Most significantly, this deed specifically included the land upon which the crooked chimney stood. "The document has been in our family for centuries," Eleanor said with quiet pride. "With the railway expansion, it might finally have real commercial value. Modern courts have been known to honor such ancient claims when substantial sums are involved." "Have you ever shown this deed to anyone outside your family?" Miss Marple inquired with carefully concealed interest. Eleanor's hesitation suggested internal conflict about this question. "There was one occasion. Harold Briggs expressed an interest in local history when he was managing the inn. I showed him several family documents, including the deed, thinking he might find them interesting given his connection to the property. That was several months ago, before any of this railway business began." This revelation provided Miss Marple with the crucial understanding of Briggs's true motivation. The former landlord had not only known about the deed's existence, but had recognized its potential value when the railway development plans became public knowledge. Rather than informing Eleanor of the document's modern significance, he had apparently chosen to pursue his own profit from this information. Further investigation revealed that Briggs had indeed been conducting secret negotiations with Cecil Ashford, using his knowledge of the deed's existence to position himself as an intermediary in the property transaction. The burned fragments found at the inn represented not Eleanor's family document, but a copy that Briggs had made during his examination of the original. Miss Marple's understanding of the crime's true nature crystallized during a final examination of the crooked chimney's interior, conducted with Inspector Craddock's permission while he pursued other lines of inquiry. The physical evidence, when viewed with proper understanding of the participants' true relationships, told a story quite different from the one initially assumed. The arrangement of objects in the room suggested a meeting of some duration, during which two people had sat before the fire discussing business matters. The teacup showed traces of the digitalis poison, but the pattern of residue indicated that the fatal dose had been administered gradually rather than all at once. This suggested that Briggs had systematically poisoned his victim while maintaining the pretense of friendly negotiation. Most tellingly, Miss Marple discovered evidence that supported her theory about the meeting's true purpose. Hidden beneath the chair cushion, she found fragments of correspondence in Ashford's handwriting, apparently torn up and concealed during his final moments. The fragments that remained legible suggested that Ashford had discovered Briggs's deception and was threatening to expose him to both Eleanor and the authorities. As she pieced together the final elements of Harold Briggs's scheme, Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction that accompanied the resolution of a complex puzzle. The crime had been carefully planned and skillfully executed, relying upon misdirection and the manipulation of existing tensions within the village. However, like all human enterprises built upon deception, it contained within itself the seeds of its own exposure. Chapter 8. Justice at the Crooked Chimney. Inspector Craddock's initial skepticism regarding Miss Marple's request for a final gathering at the Crooked Chimney dissolved when she quietly presented him with the complete chain of evidence she had assembled. His years of police work had taught him to recognize thoroughness when he encountered it, and the elderly lady's methodical approach had uncovered details that his own investigation had missed. "Very well, Miss Marple," he said after reviewing her observations. "If you believe this gathering will resolve the matter definitively, I'm willing to proceed. Though I must say, your methods are somewhat unconventional. Human nature, Inspector, follows patterns that are quite conventional once one learns to recognize them," Miss Marple replied gently. "In my experience, the truth emerges most clearly when all parties are present to hear it together." The gathering was arranged for the late afternoon, when the November light would cast long shadows through the crooked chimney's ancient windows. Those present included Eleanor Venning, Harold Briggs, Reverend Mallory, Dr. Fleming, Tom Fletcher, and several villagers whose testimony had proved relevant to the investigation. Miss Marple positioned herself near the great hearth where Cecil Ashford had met his end, her knitting bag beside her and her gentle demeanor giving no indication of the devastating revelations she was about to deliver. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with expectation and unspoken tensions. "We have gathered," she began in her soft, clear voice, "to discuss the death of Mr. Cecil Ashford, which has been officially determined to be murder by digitalis poisoning. The circumstances appeared to present an impossible crime. A man found dead in a sealed room with no apparent means of entry or exit." Eleanor Venning sat rigidly upright in her chair, her aristocratic features composed but watchful. Harold Briggs fidgeted with his cap, his eyes darting between Miss Marple and the various exits from the room. The discovery of the secret passage naturally seemed to resolve this impossibility. Miss Marple continued. Such passages were common in buildings of this period, used for smuggling and other clandestine activities. However, the existence of a means does not necessarily identify the person who employed it. Inspector Craddock stepped forward slightly, lending official weight to the proceedings. Miss Marple has discovered evidence that significantly alters our understanding of this crime. The first misconception, Miss Marple said, reaching into her knitting bag to withdraw a small envelope, concerns the burned parchment found on the mantelpiece. This was not Miss Venning's ancient family deed, but rather a copy made by someone who had examined the original document months earlier. She handed the envelope to Inspector Craddock, who examined its contents before passing them to Dr. Fleming for verification. "Mr. Harold Briggs," Miss Marple continued, her voice remaining gentle but gaining authority, "you were shown Miss Venning's deed during your time as landlord, when you expressed interest in local history. You recognized its potential value when railway development plans became known, but rather than informing Miss Venning, you chose to pursue your own profit." Briggs's face had grown pale, but he maintained his composure. "I don't understand what you're suggesting, ma'am." "I'm suggesting that you secretly contacted Mr. Ashford's railway company, claiming to represent Miss Venning's interests while actually planning to broker a fraudulent sale. You arranged to meet Mr. Ashford at the inn using the secret passage you had discovered during your maintenance work on the building." Eleanor Venning turned sharply to stare at Briggs, her eyes flashing with sudden understanding. "You knew. You knew about the deed's value and said nothing? You were planning to steal my family's inheritance?" Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Mr. Briggs had prepared for this deception carefully. He had retained pharmaceutical equipment from the old apothecary's shop and had cultivated his own foxglove plants for medicinal purposes. When Mr. Ashford arrived for their clandestine meeting, he brought legal expertise that quickly exposed the fraud. Ashford realized he was being deceived, Inspector Craddock added, following Miss Marple's reasoning. He threatened to expose Briggs to both parties and to the authorities for attempted fraud. Precisely. Faced with the collapse of his scheme and the prospect of criminal charges, Mr. Briggs decided that Mr. Ashford must be silenced. The digitalis was administered gradually during their meeting, disguised in tea while they discussed the supposed transaction. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. The murder was carefully planned to create confusion about timing and method. Mr. Briggs used his intimate knowledge of the inn's construction to stage the scene, lighting the fire after Mr. Ashford's death and positioning the stopped watch to suggest a false timeline. She withdrew another item from her bag, fragments of torn correspondence. Most significantly, these fragments were found hidden beneath the chair cushion. Mr. Ashford had realized the deception and was preparing to document it when the poison took effect. The handwriting is his, threatening to expose what he calls criminal fraud involving forged authorization. Briggs had begun to shift nervously in his chair, his composure finally beginning to crack under the methodical accumulation of evidence. "The torn fabric found in the secret passage," Miss Marple continued, "matches the recent repairs to your jacket, Mr. Briggs. The soot on your clothing the morning after the murder came from lighting the fire at the inn, not from cleaning your own chimney, as you claimed. You made several trips through that passage in the weeks before the murder," Inspector Craddock added, "planning your crime and ensuring you could execute it without detection." "Harold Briggs," the inspector said with official authority, "I arrest you for the murder of Cecil Ashford and for conspiracy to defraud. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." The fight seemed to go out of Briggs all at once. His shoulders sagged, and he looked suddenly older and more tired than his years. "I never meant for it to go so far," he said quietly. "It was supposed to be just a business arrangement. Everyone would have benefited. Miss Venning would have gotten money she never expected, Ashford would have gotten his land, and I would have received a fair commission. But Mr. Ashford was too experienced to be deceived by forged documents," Miss Marple observed gently. "When he demanded to see proper authorization and threatened to contact Miss Venning directly, your scheme collapsed." Briggs nodded miserably. He said he would report me to the police for fraud, that I would face years in prison. I only meant to make him ill, to give myself time to sort things out properly. But digitalis is a treacherous substance, Dr. Fleming observed gravely. The margin between a debilitating dose and a fatal one is dangerously narrow, particularly when administered to someone with an unknown heart condition. The confession, when it came in full, revealed the complete scope of Briggs's deception. He had indeed been planning the fraud for months, carefully cultivating Ashford's interest while concealing his lack of authority to negotiate on Eleanor's behalf. The secret passage had been discovered during routine maintenance work years earlier, and he had always planned to use it if circumstances required discretion. Eleanor Venning, vindicated of suspicion and confirmed as the rightful owner of valuable property, announced her intention to negotiate fairly with the railway company, with a substantial portion of any compensation going toward the church roof fund and village improvements. As the official proceedings concluded and the gathered villagers began to disperse, Miss Marple found herself standing once more before the great hearth where the tragedy had unfolded. The ancient stones seemed to hold their secrets more lightly now that the truth had been revealed. Inspector Craddock approached her with evident respect. "Your methods may be unconventional, Miss Marple, but they are undeniably effective. How did you first suspect Briggs rather than the more obvious suspects?" Miss Marple smiled gently, folding her knitting into its familiar bag. "In my experience, Inspector, the most dangerous criminals are often those who position themselves as helpful and knowledgeable about the very things they plan to exploit." Mr. Briggs's eagerness to discuss the inn's secrets, combined with his obvious intimate knowledge of the building, suggested someone with both opportunity and hidden motives. The late afternoon light was fading as Miss Marple and Dorothy made their way back to Rose Cottage, leaving the crooked chimney to settle once more into peaceful silence. The ancient building had finally surrendered its secrets, and the village of Rook's Hollow could begin to heal from the wounds inflicted by greed and betrayal. Behind them, the famous crooked chimney maintained its precarious angle against the darkening sky, no longer the keeper of dark secrets, but simply an enduring witness to the triumph of truth over deception. And so, tonight's mystery closes like a rare book returned to its shelf, its secrets uncovered, its final page turned. What seemed bound in shadows has been revealed by reason, persistence, and the unyielding search for truth. Were you able to trace the clues before the last chapter? Share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading your theories. If you found yourself drawn into this case, please give the video a like and subscribe for more stories waiting to be discovered here in the Hidden Library. Your support helps keep these shelves alive with new mysteries. Until we meet again, keep your curiosity alive, your mind keen, and I will see you in the next episode.